Hi everyone, welcome to our second Energy Insight webinar. We're just going to give it a few minutes for everybody to join us. Hi everyone, welcome to our Energy Insight webinar. I can see that we've got lots of people joining. We're just going to give it a few more minutes and then we'll make a start. Just give it another moment. Right, let's make a start. So, afternoon everyone, my name is Helen Gardner. I am Market Policy Change Lead at npower Business Solutions. So my role is to support customers with all things policy to ensure that customers understand what's happening in the industry and how it could impact their businesses in the future, and also to ensure that we as npower Business Solutions have appropriate solutions in place to support customers with all things policy. So this is our second Energy Insight webinar. Thank you for joining us. I'll be moderating today's event and we're joined by experts from across the business. As you all know, npower Business Solutions is now powered by E.ON. So we have E.ON experts with us today. And we're also delighted to be joined by Caroline Bragg from the Association for Decentralised Energy, who will be talking to us about all things embedded generation. So lots to cover today. Let's have a look at the agenda. So we're going to start by having a look at energy prices in the context of the fire last week at the IFA French interconnector. So very topical at the moment. We'll then be taking a look at the access and forward-looking charges review and how that will impact non-commodity charges. We'll then be having a look at more future change and the UK hydrogen strategy that was recently announced a few weeks ago. We'll then be handing over to Caroline Bragg at the ADE, who will be talking to us about the changing landscape for embedded generators. We'll then follow on with a look at the upcoming heat and building strategy, and then follow on with the green gas levy, which is a new charge on gas bills. And then finally, we'll be taking a look at the upcoming triad season and what businesses can do to prepare for that. So we do have time for questions at the end. You should be able to see a question box on the right-hand side of your screen. So please feel free to ask us a question at any point during the next hour, and we'll cover them off at the end. We'll try to get through as many of your questions as possible, but if we don't get to your question, then we'll be sure to get in touch with you after the webinar, so every question will be answered. So before we get into the content, what I'd like to do, if that's okay, is quickly just say hello to all of our experts that have joined us today. So experts, if I could quickly read out your name and if you could do a quick hello, who you are and what you do, that'd be great, if that's okay. So if I couldn't start with you, Ali Hope.
Hello everyone. Yes, my name's Alistair Hope, otherwise known as Ali. Yeah, and I'm a portfolio manager here on the trading floor, looking after flexible customers and trying to navigate and buy their gas and power requirements.
And Greg?
Yeah, hi Helen, hi everybody. My name's Greg Evans. I'm a senior business development manager within E.ON, and will be part of the forward operating model as E.ON and npower merge together. My role within the business is to speak to customers, talk to customers, try and help them mitigate these troubled waters and try and find a pathway through.
Matt?
Hi, my name is Matt Cullen, and I'm a policy manager here at E.ON. I talk to BAYS and Ofgem and trade associations on lots of topics, but primarily network charging and flexibility, with a little bit of hydrogen thrown in for good measure.
Caroline?
Hi, yes, good afternoon everyone. I'm the Head of Policy at the ADE.
Thanks for joining us, Caroline. And Dan?
Hi everybody, Dan Meredith, Energy Policy Expert at E.ON also.
And Thomas Paul?
Hi everyone. Yeah, I'm Tom Paul, and I'm in the third-party cost forecasting team here. Thanks.
And finally, Sandeep.
Hi everyone, I'm Sandeep Guban. I work in the short-term optimization team within the E.ON Energy Markets. So we're responsible for managing the power and gas requirements for all of our customer portfolios from day ahead right until the point it's delivered.
Well, thank you everyone for joining us today. Let's get straight into the content as there's lots to cover, and we'll start with an energy market update.
Okay, so yeah, over to me to try and give a bit of an understanding as to why gas and power prices have moved up so much, especially in comparison to last year. I think you can trace the bullish move around about back to May this year. It's not just forwards prices that have moved up pretty aggressively, but also the day ahead as well. So those prompt prices on near-term delivery have also been very high as well. There's a number of things that sort of led into this this bullish run. The first thing that probably triggered it was an extended winter. It wasn't particularly cold, but it lasted well into the summer. This kept residential demand quite high. The market didn't necessarily start to panic at this point. A lot of market participants were expecting LNG, liquefied natural gas, to start coming over from Qatar and America. But that didn't happen due to high demand in South America and the Far East. Russian flows into Europe, although the UK doesn't receive an awful lot of Russian gas direct, it was certainly those lower flows moving into Europe were certainly making the European markets a lot more bullish, and in particular the low storages throughout Europe, especially the Gazprom-owned sites, really sort of boosted the market through the summer, with a lot of concern starting to develop for the winter about where gas was going to come from. On top of all of this, especially in the gas market, was a number of unplanned outages that lasted for quite some time, both on the UK continental shelf and also Norwegian continental shelf. And this has just really sort of developed quite a dire situation or potentially dire situation for the winter. Where gas prices go in the UK, then power prices will follow. So power prices have moved up in similar on the sort of the front season. But what you can also see here on the slide in front of you is some record-breaking prices on the UK power day ahead price. 2 or 3 days in a row, just record prices being delivered. And this is a real warning for what might happen through the winter, because we've got a number of various outages at coal, gas, and nuclear plants. And when the wind doesn't blow and you get low wind output, then we struggle to meet demand through those peak hours of the day, and that has led to those very high day ahead prices there. And this has also started to support the spark spread for the winter as well. As temperatures drop, there could be more concern and more high prices through the winter if the wind doesn't blow. And one of the pieces of news that really sort of dominated the markets last week was a fire at an operations centre that controlled part of the IFA cable, an interconnector that connects the UK and France. It was quite a serious fire, and this has taken out half of the capacity of that interconnector through until the end of March 2022. So what we've essentially had is a price shock, and then with that fire and that interconnector being out for the winter, we've had another price shock on top as well. And that has left it has reduced our ability to import power from the continent by about 1 gigawatt for the whole of the winter. The North Sea Link cable might be online at some point through 2021, but I think the testing is still ongoing. So at the moment, yeah, certainly looking like quite a tight situation in both gas and power for this winter. So yeah, I'm going to hand you over to Greg now, who's going to be able to hopefully talk you through some of the options that are available to you if you are still looking to lock in on energy contracts, energy supply contracts for the winter. Over to you, Greg.
Thanks, Ali. So yeah, I think the first thing businesses need to do is to acknowledge the circumstance in the market and understand that the time for simply hoping that the markets will reverse has passed. As Ali's explained, nearly all of the risk is now sitting in the bullish sentiment. And whilst none of us in this industry have crystal balls, this continuing bullish trend means businesses must start to formulate strategies and not simply place their hope in a reversal of current market circumstance. So if you do have an open position coming into the winter months, the time has come for action. I think the most important thing businesses can do is to seek support, advice, and some counsel, because the implication of doing nothing has now become very clear. So please speak to your account managers, speak to your client leads, and discuss what options are available and what the best course is for your business that are based on the facts that are available right now. Because with the volatility in the markets, this position can change on a daily basis. So please ensure you have the information necessary to make informed decisions on what to do next. If, for example, you normally take fixed contracts, it might be better for your business to look at more flexible opportunities, which will enable you to manage your business spend over your contract period more effectively. If you don't feel like you have the in-house expertise in order to do this, please reach out to E.ON and Empower and let us know, because we have a variety of managed service options available that are designed to mitigate against the very cost shocks that we're currently seeing in the markets. And we can protect you from them through a coherent, bespoke business energy strategy and look at maximising opportunities where we see them in the markets. If you're a flexible customer, then let us support you with market intelligence. Let us review the current contract in place and see what opportunities might be found in the forward curve that can currently mitigate the markets. It's important to talk through your options with the relevant people associated to your account. And as far as the future is concerned, I think one thing that I hope will emerge from this is the need to have a fully enactable strategy when it comes to energy spend. Far too many businesses in the UK leave themselves open to the mercy of the markets, hoping that the chance that they take on the day that they procure pays off. And there is so much more information that energy companies can provide for you that move you away from hoping that you've secured a good price to knowing that you have a robust energy strategy based not simply on securing an initially good price, but protecting you from the types of situation that are prevalent in the marketplace today.
Thanks both. That sounds quite scary if you're trying to manage your energy costs at the moment. If we hand over now to Matt Cullen to look at the other side of charges and what's happening with the access and forward-looking charges that will impact the non-commodity elements.
Okay, thank you very much, Helen, and hello everyone. Yes, I'm here to sort of give a brief summary of what's been happening with some of the significant code reviews that Ofgem has been leading over the last few years. I'm sure as many of you are aware that there have been two major significant code reviews that have been out to industry and consultation. The first was the targeted charging review, which was looking at how residual charges associated with TNUoS and UOS should be charged. And we're just about coming to the end of that. And I'm sure that Sandeep will take us through some more of that and what it means to triad charging later on. But what I'm going to focus my time on for the next few minutes is the access and forward-looking charges, SCR. So this is the significant code review that Ofgem launched back in 2019, and was to look at the forward-looking element of the charge. So the charge that is part of what you, or how much is based on how much you use and when you use it, but also looks at the access rights that you can have as a business. So the access SCR was progressing well. It was at one point, though, it decided that some bits were going to take longer and had a lot of knock-on consequences with Ofgem's other pieces of work on flexibility. And so the Access SCR was split into two, with the first bit being the bit that they have recently consulted on. So that was associated with new access rights. It was associated with the connection boundary, and also TNUoS charges for small distribution, connected generation. So the other part of the Access SCR, the review of DUOS, has been paused. Well, it's not been paused. It's more, it's expected later on in the year. So we might see a Minded To decision out towards the end of this year or early next year is the hope. So what do we know about what's being proposed in Ofgem's Minded To decision around access rights? So as a lot of you will be aware, when you are connecting to the network, you have a choice. You can have a firm connection, which means that you have the right to use as much electricity up to a certain capacity, or you can, if your DNO allows, take on a flexible connection, which means that you can take as much electricity as you want up to a certain limit, but that the DNO reserves the right to curtail you if the system gets stressed. So that's the situation as it is today. Ofgem have been looking at what else they could introduce to access rights to help alleviate some of the stresses to the networks. So the first thing to note, I guess, is that everything I'm about to talk about regarding to access rights is only really for businesses. So there's been no changes to the access rights for small users. They will continue to have up to 100 amps, as much as they want, up to 100 amps. And there's also no changes in regards to transmission access either. That we will not be seeing an alignment of transmission access and distribution access, with transmission access giving financially firm connections. What is being taken forward are two options, one brand spanking new, which is time profile distribution access rights, and that will allow you to have access that is, says it on the tin, it's time profiled. So you might be able to have 10 kilowatt or 100 kilowatts during the day, and then you pull that right back down to 10 kilowatts overnight. It might be a seasonal change, or it could be a combination of the two. So this will be particularly beneficial if you've got large amounts of PV, for example, that obviously doesn't generate during the night, or if your processes and your business is very seasonal. So that's a Minded To decision to introduce time profiled access rights. The other one is just to firm up what we mean by flexible access, or non-firm access, as Ofgem like to call it. So at the moment, each DNO has some differences between their flexible connections, their flexible contracts, and what they're prepared to pay for those. Ofgem want to standardize that and make it fairly clear exactly how many hours you could be curtailed for what price you would have to pay to be certain of only being curtailed 5 hours, 10 hours, 100 hours a year, which would still be at the DNO's discretion, but there would be a cap placed on that. So that's just a sort of making the existing situation a bit clearer. What you will be able to do is you will be able to combine time profiled access and flexible access. I should also say that all of this firm access is still very much available, but obviously with the issues around it of if the DNO has that spare capacity or has to reinforce the network, and we'll get onto that in just a second. One of the options that was being considered by Ofgem was shared access. So that would be a number of parties getting clubbing together and agreeing what their total access capacity would be, and then agreeing between them how they would share that out, and then they would be responsible for ensuring that they didn't exceed that. Ofgem are not convinced that there's enough demand for this, plus the contractual ramifications were considered quite difficult. It is being taken forward by the ENA through the Open Networks project, but it will not form part of the minded to or the final decision. So what does this mean for you as a customer? Well, if you have an existing site, there's no impact unless you already have a flexible contract. But if you are looking to build new sites, or you're thinking about bringing on-site generation or embedded generation, this should give you more alternatives. So you could be looking at installing a PV solar farm, and therefore time profiled access might be right up your street. Or you might be looking at extending an existing factory, and there again you might, because of the constraints on the local network, a flexible contract or flexible access might be more appropriate to you. But these are the changes that Ofgem have released in terms of their minded to decision. Connection boundaries is the second part of the minded to decision, and this is all to do with who pays for reinforcement of the local network, the distribution network. So currently what happens if you are requesting a new connection to from the DNO, and that will lead to reinforcement. Now, whether you are demand or generation, you currently have to pay a percentage of all reinforcements, not just at your connecting voltage level, but also at the voltage above. So if you're connecting at LV, low voltage, then any reinforcement associated with the next level up or high voltage, you would also have to pay a percentage of those reinforcement costs. What the minded to decision is considering is to socialize those reinforcement costs, which means that the reinforcement costs would no longer be borne by the connecting party, but will be socialized across all customers in that DUOS region. That's true for new demand, so new housing developments or new factories or new shops. If you're looking to build a new generating asset, then Ofgem's minded to decision currently says that you will still have to pay a percentage of the reinforcement, but you no longer have to pay it at the next voltage up. So you will only be having to pay for some of the reinforcement at LV if you're connecting at LV, or HV if you're connecting at HV, which should obviously lower the reinforcement charges that you could be associated with. What I should say is that obviously if you're connecting demand or generation in a region that isn't constrained, then reinforcement isn't required, and therefore you don't see these costs, and these connection boundaries will not have any implications to your new assets. Ofgem are estimating that the cost of socialization of these new reinforcement costs will be of the order £380 million for across the next 17 years, which is not a huge amount. We're estimating if you were doing that across every single domestic customer, that'll add £1 onto your bill. But what we do see is that if this allows embedded generation, and especially embedded renewable generation, to come on faster, then it will mean that £380 million is paid back to the customer very quickly in terms of lower costs of wholesale prices. And the other benefit of connection boundaries, as is being suggested, is that the DNO at the moment can only take a very piecemeal attitude to reinforcement. It can only reinforce according to what it has been asked to do for it to be added onto the network. It can't do anticipatory reinforcement which so if a factory is connecting on one part of the network and it would make sense for them to upgrade another part because they suspect that there's a lot of EV coming on in the next couple of years, they can't currently do that under their price control. But with these changes, that should make that more sensible, and DNOs will be able to take account of that whole system approach. So what will this mean for you? Well, as a business, it might mean that your DNO, your DOS charges go up very slightly if you live in or if your business is sited in a constrained part of the network. But if you are thinking of new assets or extending the business, then there is less chance of having reinforcement costs absolutely crippling your business case. And as I said, it does also mean that DNOs can take a more proactive approach to reinforcement, and therefore, with any luck, your area would become less constrained, even if the DNOs are not receiving an additional requests to connect. So, Helen, could you move on to the last bit? I am in danger of veering onto Caroline's territory here, so I will try and keep it brief. But the third part of the access and forward-looking charge here, SCR, is proposals to charge embedded generators to NUOS. So currently, embedded generators don't pay to NUOS, they pay EAT, or embedded export tariff. And when I say pay, it's actually a credit if you're in the right part of the country, and it's capped at 0, so you don't actually pay embedded export tariff at any point. But it's felt that this is creating boundary distortions and not incentivizing the correct builds. So Ofgem's minded to decision is that any embedded generator greater than 1 megawatt will now be charged or will be charged to NUOS. And they believe that that will bring a customer benefit of approximately £500 million between now and 2040. Ofgem have been a bit cagey about implementation. They have not given an implementation date for this, and they are also talking about transitional arrangements, so the possibility of grandfathering if you're an embedded generator. So you might get a long transitional arrangement before you move from EAT to NUOS. And their preferred way of charging this would be for the ESO, who is responsible for collecting to NUOS charges, to agree what's called a technical export capacity, or a TEC, with the embedded generator, and then the supplier, or E.ON in our case, would be charged that, and we would pass it through in our costs to you. So how's this going to impact customers? Well, I'm afraid that this is quite a locational change, a locational charge. And so if you are a small embedded generator up in Scotland, you will definitely feel the pinch. So at the moment, you do not pay embedded export tariff. It's capped out at 0 there. But to NUOS is of the order of £40 a kilowatt in the Highlands of Scotland. On the other hand, if you're down in London or in the southeast, you currently get export tariff, EAT, and the NUOS credits that you will get will be broadly the same as those. There might be slightly less, but the difference will be not wholly significant. So there are issues around where you are located with these changes. And the final thing to say is just that if you are behind the meter, or you're using on-site generation that sits behind a settlement meter, then you will not be affected by these changes. I believe I'm also here to talk about a hydrogen strategy, which is another government strategy that's come out quite recently. Hydrogen is seen by some as a major fuel source, I guess, going into the 2030s, 2040s, and 2050s, as being very versatile. It could be used for transportation, heating, power generation, but obviously when it is burnt, does not produce any carbon dioxide. So a pretty nifty gas, if you like. I think most people accept that it's where it will first make its presence felt will be industrial heat. So a replacement for natural gas for the industries like cement, glass, aluminium smelting, all these large-scale energy-intensive industries. So the government in their hydrogen strategy are really just setting out a roadmap of how they want the UK to move forward in terms of hydrogen production. And most of the strategy does focus on hydrogen production, with Boris Johnson's 10-point plan target of having 5 gigawatts of hydrogen production by 2030. So what can we expect from hydrogen? So the government have tried their very best to forecast where they believe we will be with hydrogen by 2050. I think it's safe to say it's not an immediate change overnight for most people. By 2030, we're only expecting to see about a market worth about 900 million and only to have created about 9,000 jobs UK-wide. However, I think there is a lot of bullish belief around where it could end up, and with hydrogen being predicted to be worth 13 billion per annum and creating 100,000 jobs and making up nearly a third of the UK's energy consumption. So there is real ambition to see hydrogen being used across the country, but especially for energy intensive industries. So, like I said, most of the strategy is focused on production. As some of you may or may not know, hydrogen comes in different colours. So blue hydrogen being the creation of hydrogen from natural gas. A chemical reaction, I can't remember the acronym for at the moment, but which would then the carbon dioxide that is emitted is captured and stored underground. And that's blue hydrogen. And then you have green hydrogen from electrolysis of water. This is known as green hydrogen because it would use green electricity from renewables and then, in theory, be carbon neutral in its production. So government are very keen to see to support both these hydrogen production techniques, and they will also be launching a review looking at how hydrogen should be stored and moved around the country as well. But the main thing to say about hydrogen in terms of how it's going to affect demand customers is that hydrogen in its infancy will need supporting, and government's main way of wanting to support hydrogen production is a business model very similar to what we've seen for offshore wind and other renewables through the contracts for difference mechanism, where a strike price is agreed, and if the wholesale price moves below that, then the suppliers pay the difference, and if it moves above that, then hydrogen producers give back the difference, and that way you have a guaranteed price for hydrogen moving forward. Now, obviously, that's going to need funding by suppliers or government, and I think that's still very much up for grabs. It may be added to another levy that may get added to your gas bill or electricity bill. It may be decided that government want to pay this through general taxation. So this is yet to be decided upon. Can you move on to the next slide, Helen, please? So just to say that the details about supply side hydrogen have been very limited in the strategy. So there's talk about the blending of hydrogen, which should be for the customer, they should not see any difference. Most appliances will be able to work at the blending level of 20% hydrogen, but also mainly for smaller scale heating, so office heating and other types of domestic heating. A decision is going to be made about the rollout of hydrogen-ready boilers and whether that's a good idea or not. So there'll be a decision made 2026. If you are an industry that's interested in producing hydrogen, then there are funding pots that have been announced for that. So and the numbers are up there. They're significant numbers. But and then there's also support to encourage the supply chain opportunities for the hydrogen economy going forward. But the one funding pot I ought to highlight is that there's a £55 million for industrial fuel switching competition. And this is phase 2 of that competition. The first phase was £20 million and ran between 2016 and 2019. So if you have got an energy intensive process that uses a lot of natural gas, then there is an opportunity to tap into some government money there. And I would urge you to talk to E.ON or Npower Business Services if you are possibly interested in that. I think that's my last slide, Helen. Oh no, there's one more actually, but it's really just to summarize. If you have no direct involvement in hydrogen, then the hydrogen strategy doesn't also say a huge amount that we didn't already know, other than watch out, support for hydrogen may get added to your electricity or gas bills moving forward. If you're interested in using hydrogen instead of natural gas, then I've already just highlighted there are some funding pots to look at that, and they would be really interested to hear from you. And finally, if you're interested in producing hydrogen, then this strategy has a lot to say about what you need to do and how to go about it. And I would urge you to have a conversation with E.ON as soon as you can, and we will look at how we can help with that. Thanks, Helen.
Thanks, Matt. Thanks for both updates. We've had loads of questions come through, especially on the first one around access and forward-looking charges, and hopefully Caroline's going to cover some of it as well, and then we'll cover the questions at the end. So I'll hand over to you, Caroline, please.
Perfect, thank you, and thanks very much for having me. I'm going to build a little bit on Matt's comments to talk you through what the network charging reforms will mean for embedded generators, as well as the other reforms that are taking place at the moment. So to start with, the access reforms as they stand so far, as Matt mentioned, are quite mixed for embedded generation. On the one hand, we've got the potential for reduced fees for connections where reinforcement is triggered, and we've got more options and hopefully more control over non-firm connections, all of which is positive. We've also got, in a sort of parallel piece of work that's continuing, reforms to BSUOS, which is the Balancing Services Use of System charges. It's likely that that reform will mean that BSUOS is removed from generation from 2023, but will remain a pence per kilowatt hour charge on demand, which should be positive for embedded generators, although we'll have to see the impact on the wholesale price. However, there are also broader changes that could be a bit more mixed, as Matt mentioned too. So firstly, the proposal to require embedded generations to pay to NUOS against their capacity. That really depends on where you are in terms of the impact that might have on you. And secondly, there is also a proposal in the Access Minded 2 decision to remove the floor for the embedded export tariff. At the minute, what that floor does, as Matt was saying, was basically prevent you from moving into a charge for that part of your non-commodity charge. So you can only be paid or you can pay zero. If they were to remove the floor, that would mean that in cases where the demand charges were to move to being a charge on demand, that embedded export tariff could, in theory, become a charge on generators to export. So it's something to watch. As we talked about, there's some uncertainty in terms of where these reforms go and how they are implemented. There is an option where they could be implemented in the next few years with some of the transitional arrangements Matt talked about in terms of grandfathering, for example. But there's also the potential that they could be kicked further down the line as we look at broader TNUoS reform. So I wanted to say a little bit about what we might expect in the future, both from DUOS and also for TNUoS for embedded generators. On the DUOS reform, if we start there, I think the big topic is whether distribution charging will be allowed in some areas to charge generation for its export. That would be very different from where we are right now, where you either get credits or it's floored at zero. The areas where that could happen is where Ofgem considers that those areas are generation dominated areas. So areas effectively where generation is the one causing reinforcement or constraints on the network. The other suggestion is that they may make distribution charging, so this forward-looking DUOS part, much more locational. So it could vary, for example, within a given DNO area for voltages such as high voltage. All of this, I think, creates a broad picture of the location where you're sited, both in terms of existing and new generation assets, starting to matter more in terms of what your network charges end up as. But I have to say that the detail around this and the financial implications are still pretty scant at present. Secondly, to TNUoS reform. So this could be quite significant. This reform is really being driven by a couple of things, actually. The first thing is the massive expansion of offshore wind that the industry is pushing for and government is pushing for. There's a question as part of that as to whether the government and industry will need to take a more strategic, I guess, more coordinated approach to how you build out that infrastructure, and less of a incremental offshore wind farm by offshore wind farm approach that they've taken to date, and what that would mean as knock-on impacts for network charging. The second thing is how we model overall system demand. What we found through the targeted charging review is that when you remove that massive lump of charges they've just taken out of Triad, you get some quite strange consequences where, for example, some areas of demand, particularly very north of Scotland, would have actually been paid effectively to demand at peak times to the system, which is a strange consequence that is pointing to some underlying issues in how we're modeling the system for the purposes of network charging. The final thing that's driving it that we've been talking about today is the growth in decentralized energy, both in terms of distribution and distributed generation, as well as storage. So for all these reasons, there is now a new, much broader reform of TNUoS underway that could have really quite significant implications for embedded generation, both in terms of opportunities, but also some risks. Finally, I just wanted to touch on some broader developments coming up that I think are part of this picture and also create some opportunities and risks going forward. The first is changes to the DNOs. From 2023, they will be subject to new incentives, which are being decided now. And certainly Ofgem's ambition for those incentives is that they push the DNOs to further develop and expand their flexibility markets, which should, if embedded generators are in the right place, offer a new source of revenue. The second thing is that there are also broader changes taking place at national level. I think for embedded generators, the big ones are the reform of the capacity market, the potential introduction of decarbonisation readiness requirements for generators above 1 megawatt, and also the reform to the ESO's balancing services. I think suffice to say, along with the network charging reforms that we're seeing, there are two really big themes that come out of those reforms. The first is that probably more active management of your export and import is going to become more important. And secondly, where you're siting new assets will also increasingly become important to your exposure to some of these reforms. Thanks very much.
Thanks, Caroline. That's really interesting. So it's not as simple as saying it's a benefit or a risk, this policy. It will depend on your location.
Yeah, exactly.
Fab. Right. So we're going to hand over to Dan now to talk to us about the heat and building strategy.
Hi, thanks, Ellen. Hi, everybody. I really wish I could talk about the heat and building strategy, but unfortunately, the longer-awaited building strategy is still longer-awaited. So I'll be a very short update from me. Clearly, I think we've now got a hard deadline when we expect it. The COP26 in November really is the deadline for the government to have some political confidence about the really big heating sector problem it's got and what it's going to do about it in terms of climate change. Chancellor has now confirmed that the autumn budget and the results of the comprehensive spending review that's going on for government as well is going to be on the 27th of October. So given the need for support for both residential and business on heating and how we're going to improve our energy efficiency across the country and change to decarbonisation of our heating supplies, that's likely to take a lot of support. Those things are really going to have to be included in the heating building strategy, and we're going to have that document out to really understand it within the next month or so. Worth noting, and if the gas prices and the electricity prices that you've heard about already and you're seeing every day aren't enough to drive you towards energy efficiency, which I'm sure they probably are, there's still quite a lot of drivers within the industry, and we know the direction of travel to use far less gas, particularly in this country, but far less energy as well. We've already got some indication from government that the non-domestic private renter sector, for example, the buildings that most businesses use, are going to have to be at an EPC B level by 2030. That's the proposals on the table. We're waiting for government to respond to that and put those proposals into effect. But that's likely. We've also got at the moment consultation out on ESOS, the Energy Saving Opportunity Scheme, to strengthen that scheme and try and drive action out of those audits that businesses have to undertake. E.ON's very supportive of that, but fundamentally what we want to see is more support for business to get moving and really making a difference on the amount of energy they use, particularly from their buildings in this particular case. E.ON are very supportive of that. Our submission to that comprehensive spending review for government has said that quite clearly, that business particularly is going to be needed to be supported. And actually one of the things that we've talked about as well is that there needs to be a consolidation of the schemes. There's a whole lot of different pots and schemes out there. It makes it very difficult for businesses to navigate what support is available. I think there needs to be a lot simpler scheme. I think that's all I can say at the moment, Helen. I'd love to be able to say more, but I can't.
Thanks, Dan. Maybe we'll cover it in more detail when we hopefully have it for the next Energy Insight webinar. We'll have you back. Right, I'm going to hand over to Tom Paul now to talk about the Green Gas Support Scheme and the Green Gas Levy.
Thanks, Helen. Hi. So yes, the Green Gas Support Scheme, or GGS, has been introduced by the government, BEIS, to facilitate and encourage the production of biomethane by anaerobic digestion. And it starts end of this November, quite a quick turnaround. And it's a tiered tariff guarantee system. So this means producers of the biomethane will receive a different tariff depending on how much gas they will inject to the system, as shown on the tariff there. And applications are open this autumn and are open until 2025. And they have 15-year contracts available, and they also have sort of a tight budget. So to keep within budget, they have annual caps. So where they can vary the tariffs and also delay producers entering the scheme in order to keep the caps down. So in effect, it's a bit like the feed-in tariff scheme on the electricity side, but for gas. And this is also for it's also new and current producers of this biomethane. Anyone who's currently producing it has to not be receiving any other payments from elsewhere. So next slide, please, Alan. So how are they going to fund this? So BEIS have created a green gas levy and to fund the costs of that scheme, and this will start on the 30th of November as well, and it will be charged to all suppliers apart from suppliers who supply over 95% of their gas is green gas, so they can apply for an exemption. It doesn't apply to individual customers, so only to suppliers, that exemption. And so initially, how is this going to be recovered? So initially it's going to be recovered on a meter basis. So there'll be a pence per day per meter charge. And this will come to around kind of £1.40 for the first year. And this could go up to around £6.80. So that is when they're expected the scheme to close. These prices will then kind of be increased by sort of inflation each year. However, they are expected to change the scheme to sort of a volumetric basis, so on a pence per kilowatt hour basis, from around April 2024. So this will kind of clearly for at the moment, it's quite per meter, so it is quite affects kind of residential side, and on a kind of a large energy customer, it's quite a small charge. But when it moves to a pence per kilowatt basis, it's clearly going to be a big step up in costs for your large gas users. So we don't know when this is going to change over to April 2024. So this is kind of a date that the government have given sort of an indication when they think it will change over to this point. They will consult on this in sometime before then. We don't know when it's going to come out, but so we will get to see the details of this and see how exactly they are expected to move to a volumetric basis. So when's this going to come in? So the first levies will be, we will need to know by the 30th of November. They will be released sometime before then, BEIS have said, and they will publish the levy for up until March, end of March 2021, and the levy for 22-23 first, and then on every year from that, they will set the rate in the January for the following April to March period. And yeah, that's all from me.
Thanks, Tom. So we'll get at least 1 year's notice if it was to change from a fixed rate to a volumetric charge.
I would expect so. Yes. Yeah.
Fab. Well, we'll move on to our final topic for this webinar, and that's on the triad season. So if I can hand over to you, Sandeep.
Thank you, Helen. Right, so I'm going to talk about triad and what we've got to think about for the upcoming triad season that's due in November. Before I start, for those of you that aren't familiar with the topic, triads are the mechanism through which half-hourly metered customers are charged transmission use of network charges. So the triads are the 3 half-hour settlement periods with the highest demand on the GB transmission system. And they are looked at between November and February inclusively. They need to have 10 clear days separation between the 3 triad events. So it's quite detailed trying to forecast those, because we won't know which are the 3 highest demand events until way after, at some point in March, once we've got all the settlement data. So for half-hourly customers who've got pass-through CHNUOS charges, this means that there's an incentive for them to actually reduce their consumption as much as possible during those triads, because the charge that they get for CHNUOS is based on their average consumption during those 3. So you can work to reduce, or in some cases completely avoid, the CHNUOS cost. Matt and Caroline have already mentioned about some of the changes that Ofgem are doing to the market with CHNUOS, and then also the GEOS charges, the residual elements of them. Because some customers can shift their consumption to avoid it, it means the burden of paying the cost is left for those who are unable to shift their consumption, which Ofgem see as a distortion, which is why we've had some of the changes in the market come through as part of the targeted charging review. if we could just move to the next slide, I'll cover this briefly because I'm sure you've heard quite a lot about some of these charging reviews already in this webinar. This slide was covered in the last webinar we had as well, but just a quick recap. The initial aim had been that the changes that Ofgem had proposed for both Chinuos and Duos to make it less avoidable, so a significant proportion of the charge would then be fixed, were going to come in place in April 22. Since then, Ofgem have announced a delay to the Chinuos element. They've consulted industry on that and we're just awaiting a final confirmation, but their minded to decision is that the Chinuos changes are actually delayed by a further year, which means that the changes won't come in until April 2023. What this means for our half-hourly metered customers is we have, at the best view, 2 more triad seasons before the scheme ends. So we're just going to cover quickly what are some of the considerations that us within our short-term optimization team have to do when we're considering how to call a triad. So Helen, if you wouldn't mind going to the next slide. Thank you. So I guess we'll start sort of just going in order. The simplest, it would be, okay, well, what are the forecasts for that particular day? There are forecasts available on publicly available platforms such as the Elexon Balancing Mechanism Reporting Service. You can look at what the demand estimations are. The key for us really is to consider what is and isn't included within those estimates and what the ranges are around those. So some of the things that we'll consider are the weather outturns. So we look at a range of weather providers and different weather estimation runs and consider the worst and best case scenarios with regards to temperature, rainfall, wind, solar, etc., and how much that could impact on the demand at that peak time that we're trying to forecast. One of the key considerations is wind, in particular embedded wind, which acts as negative demand. So wind that's embedded on the distribution network as opposed to being connected to the transmission network seeks to reduce down the peak demand that we see. So if we are expecting a lot of wind, then that day may not be likely to be a triad. But if that wind doesn't turn up, then all of a sudden your demand's likely to be higher than you'd originally expected at peak. Another thing that's quite crucial for us to look at are interconnectors, and this is becoming more and more important as we become increasingly interconnected with the GB market. So some of the demand figures include volume that's going to be exported on the interconnectors, which strictly speaking isn't GB demand. So when we get the final settlement figures, that export will be taken out. So we will look at what the export and import levels are on the interconnectors. Another thing we'd need to consider then are the price differentials between the GB market and the other markets that we're interconnected to, and how much of a shift it will take for those planned imports to turn to exports and vice versa, and how that might impact on the risk of a triad. Another thing to consider is what generation is actually being used to meet the demand on the system. And where that could be. So depending on where the generation is could impact the level of transmission losses that the system incurs from that generation moving down the lines to where the demand is. And those losses are taken out of the final calculations that are used for the triad calculation. The other thing I mentioned when describing the triad was that there is a requirement that there needs to be 10 clear days between each of the triads within a particular season. This then means that when we consider a day that looks like it's likely to be a triad, we'll have to look at days that might have passed in the previous up to 10 days and what might be coming up on the horizon in the following 10 days. Our aim is to try and call triads without constantly asking our customers to turn down their demand unnecessarily. So we're trying to call the right 3 within as few calls as we can. That can be very, very tricky. And an example of that would have been in the last season. The 7th of December ended up being a triad. The 8th of December, the day after, was 15 megawatts higher, which, if you think about it, is one customer's response. So it's very fine margins for error. The other thing that we'd consider is what the rest of the market is likely to do. And I suppose there's a little bit of game theory in here. So if the demand looks very clearly like it's high on that day, you're more likely to get customers within the market reducing down their demand at the peak, which then means it doesn't end up being a triad because everybody's worked together to depress the demand. So the days where it looks more marginal are the ones that actually end up being more risky for us in terms of making the right call for our customers. Then we have to consider what's happening with the demand, and in particular last season the COVID impacts were a real consideration. So we started the season on the 1st of November having just gone into another lockdown. Weren't clear when the demand would return, or if it would, or whether the first few weeks in November were our only chance of getting any high demands on the system. We've also noticed some changes in the peak shape, and there's some work to assess how permanent those are, or whether those are just the impact of lockdowns happening. When we're looking at a lot of this data, it becomes clearer closer to the point of that particular peak demand on the day. And it's a bit of a fine balance to get a good, accurate decision, but at the same time, giving our customers enough notice to actually do something about it. So clearly, we could probably be quite certain half an hour before a particular demand period, but that's not very useful to our customers to be able to shift around their processes. So what we're working to do is make a call at the day ahead, so that customers have advance warning, particularly those with industrial processes that need to get things in shape and ready to actually respond, and then refine that within day if necessary as we get more information. And linked to sort of making useful assessments for the customers, we also then assess, if we do think there's a risk of a triad, what risk category we would define that as. So is it a high or a reasonable or a slight? Again, just to give customers a bit more information to be able to make a decision on how to respond, in particular if you've got a process where actually it's only worth your while if it's a really high risk, because you can't be switching your process too regularly. So those are quite a lot of the things that we need to consider. I've just included a few charts to explain what's happened in the triad's demand over the last few seasons. So this one's showing from the 2012 season all the way up until the season just passed. And what you can see, so these are the average, so these are the triad demands, so the 3 triad periods in each of those seasons, and the red dots can show you the average demand across those 3 triads. What you can see is from 2016-17 all the way up to the 19-20 season, there was a consistent reduction in the average triad demand, which we'd seen for several years. And that's expected as people get more efficient with their energy, and we are seeing more customers able to reduce their demand during the triad. What was interesting was last year, actually, that increased, which perhaps might not have gone with what we had expected. The other interesting thing there is that National Grid's winter market review suggested that whereas in previous years they'd seen about 2 gigawatts of average triad response during the triad periods, in the season just gone that had reduced a bit to 1.7. So that could be that sort of energy consumers are changing their processes because of the COVID restrictions, and maybe their usage patterns have changed. It'll be interesting to see how that evolves for the coming season. And just a quick one on the flattening of the peak there. So the grey shaded area you can see is how often the peak was in certain periods. So settlement period 35 is the period from 1700 to 1730. So you can see that's still most often when the peak will actually land in the November to February. The blue line you can see there is then what the shape was in the 1920 season. So you can see it's starting to shift out a bit. So it's not so focused on that period. And the dashed red is then what we saw last season, where again, it started to spread across later into the evening peak. So again, this is something that we're going to watch out for, whether this is now a permanent shift in the demand shape that we see, or something that was more transient because of the conditions last year. So what as a business can you do then? The first thing we'd suggest is check with your energy supplier how your TNUoS charges are actually being applied to your energy bill. So if you are on a pass-through agreement, then that means the full charge that's due to you will be passed through. You've got a benefit or potential benefit and an opportunity to avoid or reduce those charges by reducing your consumption during triads. And if that's the case, then make sure that you're registered and you have the up-to-date contact details within your business to receive the warnings that your supplier is going to provide. And plan within your business also how you're going to respond. So what risk levels you're likely to respond at, who needs to do what, and how much notice you need to be able to make the changes to your consumption. For customers who are on supply with us, as I mentioned, we'll be sending day ahead warnings, and then also refining those within day. So you've got as much information as possible to make an informed decision that's right for your business. Alongside that, we'll be giving you risk categories of slight, reasonable, high, if we think there is a triad risk, and give you an indication of within a particular triad call. So for example, if it was for 2 hours, which particular half hours we think the highest risk falls in. So if you can only respond, your response can only be limited to half an hour, you can focus on those periods with the highest risk. We'll be sending more detailed information, detailing out everything that I've just said in October. But in the meantime, obviously, please reach out to your account manager or your client lead if you've got any more questions about that. And then I just want to finish with what happens after. So we've said we've got 2 more seasons with the Chnuas and 1 more with the Duos avoidance. Some customers have now got this flexibility that they've managed to make some cost savings with. What else can be done with it? I think we've touched on some of it earlier in the webinar, but there is some value for flexibility. It helps manage the system, and there are routes through which that you can get some revenue. So things to consider with that are what type of flexibility you have. So is it generation which requires a fuel input? Is it demand turn down? Is it batteries that you're using to shift your demand from one time to another? Give consideration to when it can be available. So are there only certain times of the day because of your business processes that you could make this flexibility available? Is it something that you could actually switch on whenever? And how much notice do you need for that? Give consideration to the cost. So I mentioned if you've got fuel costs, but also if it isn't fuel costs and you're turning down demand, there might be some associated disruption to your business processes. And just make sure that you've actually factored that into your calculations for whether it will make you money for your business. And then come and speak to us. Either speak to us if you're on supply with us, or there are dedicated demand side response providers. There's a few routes. So you can provide services to National Grid, the ESO, and supply balancing services to them. There's also scope in the wholesale markets. So Ali and Greg had covered how volatile the wholesale markets were, which is not a good side to be on when you're buying. There is scope to make some value from that if you're able to offer flexibility to help Grid manage the system when those prices are volatile. And that's it from me.
Thank you, Sandeep, and thank you to all of our experts. We're now going to go to the questions, and we'll try and get through as many as we can. Okay, so the first question is around the strategy. I believe it's the strategy for the heat and building strategy that we're waiting for. So it says, will the strategy focus include any organisations in the public sector, or is it only private businesses? I'll hand that to you, Dan.
Thanks, Ellen. Yeah, I think it's safe to say that the heat and building strategy will try and create a comprehensive strategy from the government for all buildings. So clearly, though, we already have some schemes focused on, as you say, public sector, for example. There's a bit of a dearth of real drivers in the industry and business sector. There are some in various tenures of housing for residential. What we hope from the heat and building strategy is that it will bring all of those together. So I think listeners today, absolutely the heat and building strategy is going to be critical, I hope, but certainly informative for how your buildings are going to be and what you're going to need to do to them over the next 10 years.
Thanks, Dan. These are in no particular order, so forgive me if I'm shooting around a bit. But so how long before DNOs start to offer more localised DSR schemes to balance supply and demand? Sorry. So Sandeep, is that one for you, perhaps?
Yeah, I can give that one a go. So I think we've already started to see DNOs make some movements here to help them avoid reinforcement by getting customers who are able to provide generation support flexibility to help them manage the system. I think there is quite a lot of work going on where we're looking to harmonise what the different DNOs are doing. And perhaps going to hand over to Matt if he's able to give a bit more detail on that, because I know he's closer to the detail.
No, that's fine. Your answer's bang on, Sandeep. Most of the DNOs are now offering local flexibility markets. They do them through various ways. So WPD, for example, have their own offshoot called Flexible Power. Most flexible markets can be found on something called Picklo Flex, where you can put in your assets if you want to take part in those markets, or just chatting with E.ON or your local DNO, and they should be able to point you in the right direction. And the ADE.
Well, on the AD, I think this next one is for Caroline. So it's can you provide any more detail about the likely TNUoS charges and the transitional arrangements for embedded generators?
I think the most honest answer at the minute is that it's really uncertain. You can get some kind of get your eye in, I guess, by looking at the TNUoS tariffs that are published by National Grid on a very regular basis. That gives you some idea of the quantum. But in terms of how this will work, the kinds of whether transitional arrangements will be put in place, or whether this whole thing will be kicked down the road a little bit within, into what could be a relatively lengthy TNUoS reform, I think we're just going to have to see. Hopefully we'll know by this perhaps start of next year, probably, in terms of
that was going to be my next question. Yeah. Fab, thank you. So the next one is, you mentioned a 55 million funding pot for industrial fuel switching. How will this be distributed and to who? I think that's for you, Matt, on the hydrogen.
Yeah, sure. So like I said during the conversation, it's actually a second phase of an existing competition that ran from 2016 to 2019. It's predominantly going to be focused towards energy intensives. And whatever you are doing, it needs to be pre-commercial. It needs to be innovative. So it's not about just giving you some money to go and buy an off the shelf package boiler or something like that. So, but it will be about trying to replace any process that uses natural gas with alternatives. So be that hydrogen, electrification, or even biomass and energy from waste. It will provide 100% funding, is the good news, I guess. And it opens this October. So you've got not got long to get your expressions of interest in, which are, you can find a form on the BEIS website that you can fill in and let them know.
Fab. So BEIS website is where to start. Tom, so I've got a question on the green gas levy come in. So it's, will there be any exemptions for energy intensive users? And if so, will the overall cost then be smeared among non-exempt consumers? I think that's how some of the levies work on the power side.
Yeah, good question. BEIS did mention in their initial consultation that they would look into energy intensive users and a possible exemption, because they do it with FIT and CFD at the moment. And yes, the overall cost would be smeared across all the other consumers. Obviously, this is the first charge in a while for gas, so how that in effect works is yet to be decided, and we'll know more soon, I'm sure.
Thanks, Tom. When will we know more about proposed changes to GWAS charges, and when might these be introduced? Matt, can I ask you to handle that one?
Oh, that's the $1 million question, really. So yeah, we've been going through the various options for a number of years now. Ofgem have said that their minded to decision will be out later this year, but nothing more accurate than that. I suspect it may slip into the start of next year.
Okay, thanks, Matt. We'll try and get through a couple more. We are running out of time. So should I wait to see if the market drops before buying open volume for this winter? Who can answer that for me? Greg, Ali? A question on the market and whether I should buy
Helen, I apologise, I lost you there for a second. Can we, sorry about that.
Yeah, no problem. So Greg, the question is, should I wait to see if the market drops before buying open volume for this winter?
Another excellent $1 million question. I'm sure one that people with open positions would love a definitive answer on. It really is going to depend, Helen, on your risk appetite. In truth, there isn't any upper limit. There's no ceiling as to where prices can go. So it is going to be dependent on each individual customer. What we can say is that the risk in the markets currently remains bullish. In terms of bearish, what's the good news? Nord Stream 2, the Gazprom interconnector between Russia and the EU, when that comes online, that will be bringing a lot of gas into the European Union, but we don't have a confirmed date as to when that's going to come online. So in answer to your question, honestly, it really is dependent on what the customer is thinking. If they need more advice, please feel free to reach out.
Thanks, Greg. Right, I'm afraid this is the last one. So has National Grid created a contingency plan for the loss of what I believe is around 2 gigs of winter demand, saving once the triad signal no longer exists? So Sandy, is this one you can answer on what happens after triads?
Yeah, I can give it a go. So I guess the thing to point out is that the triad demand is a tricky one for National Grid because it's not guaranteed that it's always going to be there. So they have done some estimates that in some of the triad periods there actually wasn't very much response at all. So for National Grid to manage the system, for whatever reason, they need some visibility and a bit of control over that response. So they've done quite a lot of work to help them as the system's transitioning. So the loss of the triad response is one thing, the increased intermittency mix of the generation, so as we get more wind and solar on the system, the loss of the traditional thermal generation, which provides inertia that keeps the frequency stable, are all challenges that Grid have got to get solutions for. So they have a suite of products that they've got available to them to be able to manage this. So this includes the balancing mechanism, which they've already got, reserve services, which they're enhancing, frequency services. And one thing that they are doing is a lot of reform to make these available to smaller providers. So whereas the balancing mechanism limits were 50 megawatts to participate, they've now got reduced down to 1. They're trying to make the requirements to participate less cumbersome for entrants who have got smaller scale response. So yes, they've got a suite of things that can help them manage the system even without this triad response. And there's definitely scope for smaller customers or generators to get involved with that and get some value from it.
Thank you. So, yeah, rather than avoid the costs of triads, there's ways to earn revenue through specific National Grid schemes.
Definitely, yeah.
Fab. Well, thank you to all of our experts. I'm afraid that's all we've got time for today. There are still some questions that we haven't got around to answering, so we'll get in touch with you after this webinar to answer your questions. There will be an email sent out to you as well with the link to where you can watch this webinar again, or if you want to forward it on to any of your colleagues who are interested in any of the topics that we've covered today. And other than that, we'll be doing our next Energy Insight webinar in the next quarter. We look forward to seeing you again then. Thanks, everyone.